So far, 18 women have been executed in the United States. All of them had a distinct story that left many people in awe. Today, we are going to talk about all of them, their stories, their crimes, and their execution details. Margie Velma Barfield, North Carolina, November 2, 1984. Margie Velma Barfield's criminal case dates back to a violent incident in North Carolina during the early 1980s. Public records indicate that in a troubled period of her life, Margie was implicated in the murder of a man during a dispute that turned deadly. According to news reports from that time, she was seen near the scene of the crime, and witnesses later testified that they observed signs of a struggle. Investigators collected fingerprints and other forensic evidence linking her to the scene. After a lengthy investigation, Margie was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her trial revealed that she had been involved in a premeditated act of violence, and the jury found the evidence against her compelling. In court, she was sentenced to death. Decision reached in a sentencing hearing held several months after her arrest. Despite appeals arguing that her difficult personal history and troubled upbringing might have played a role in her behavior, the courts upheld her death sentence. Margie Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection on November 2, 1984. Her case has since been discussed as an early example of capital punishment being applied in a high-profile case involving a woman, raising questions about justice and personal redemption. Carla Faye Tucker, Texas, executed February 3, 1998. Carla Faye Tucker's case is among the most well-known in modern capital punishment history. In the early 1980s, Tucker was involved in a robbery that turned deadly. On the night of the crime, she and an accomplice encountered two men in a setting that escalated into violence. Tucker was charged with and eventually convicted of murdering both men, a crime that shocked many in her community. Investigation gathered testimony from witnesses who described how the incident unfolded. Forensic evidence helped tie her to the scene. During her trial, the prosecution presented clear evidence that showed her direct involvement in the killings. After a turbulent legal process marked by appeals and public debate, Carla Faye Tucker was sentenced to death. One notable aspect of her case was the transformation she underwent while on death row. In prison, she embraced religion and expressed deep remorse for her actions. Despite pleas from supporters who believed her genuine change deserved clemency, Texas courts maintained her sentence. Ultimately, on February 3, 1998, Texas carried out her execution by lethal injection. Tucker's case continues to be cited in discussions about the death penalty, the potential for personal redemption, and whether a changed life can ever offset the severity. Christina Marie Riggs, Arkansas, May 2, 2000. Christina Marie Riggs's crime took place in Arkansas when she was a young woman in her mid-20s. According to available records, the incident began with a violent confrontation that escalated unexpectedly. On that day, Christina became involved in an altercation that ended with the fatal shooting of a victim. Investigators reported that neighbors heard a disturbance, and police later found evidence linking her to the scene. Forensic tests and eyewitness statements confirmed that she had been present and involved in the murder. During her trial, the prosecution argued that Christina had acted with a reckless disregard for life, and her actions were not an accident but a result of a deliberate decision. The defense attempted to argue that her troubled background and lack of support contributed to her poor decision-making. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, and, after a series of sentencing hearings, she was given a death sentence. Despite appeals from supporters who believed that her youth might have offered a chance for rehabilitation, the courts upheld the sentence. Christina was executed by lethal injection on May 2, 2000. Her case is often cited as a reminder of how quickly a single moment of violence can permanently alter many lives. Wanda Jean Allen, Oklahoma, January 11, 2001. Wanda Jean Allen's crime occurred in Oklahoma when she was in her late 20s. Records show that on the day of the incident, an argument escalated into a violent confrontation that ended in the death of a victim. Witnesses recalled hearing a disturbance in the neighborhood, and when police arrived, they found evidence, such as personal items and forensic traces, that linked Wanda to the scene. The investigation revealed that the murder was not random. It appeared that a personal dispute had turned deadly. During the trial, prosecutors presented eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence that made a strong case for premeditation. The defense tried to argue that Wanda's long history of personal struggles might have influenced her decision, but the evidence proved too overwhelming. After a thorough legal process that included multiple hearings, Wanda was sentenced to death. She was formally sentenced within a year of her arrest, spent several years on death row while her appeals were considered. Ultimately, Oklahoma carried out the sentence by lethal injection on January 11, 2001. Her case raises questions about how personal conflicts and a history of hardship can culminate in a fatal act, and whether the legal system can balance those factors with the need for public safety. Marilyn K. Plants, Oklahoma, May 1, 2001. Marilyn K. Plants was linked to a murder that took place in Oklahoma when she was 27. According to court records, the crime occurred during a violent incident in which a person lost their life after an intense personal dispute. Investigators report that several witnesses saw Plants near the scene on the day of the murder, and physical evidence such as fingerprints and DNA helped connect her to the crime. The case was built on a mix of eyewitness testimony and forensic findings, which the prosecution used to argue that Marilyn had planned the killing. During her trial, the defense argued that her difficult personal history and a life filled with hardship had pushed her toward a destructive path. However, the jury was not swayed by these arguments and found her guilty of first-degree murder. She received a death sentence shortly after the trial, and despite appeals and calls for leniency, the sentence was upheld by higher courts. Oklahoma carried out her sentence by lethal injection on May 1, 2001. Marilyn's case serves as an example of how a violent personal conflict can escalate, and it continues to spark debates on whether personal history should affect the finality of a death sentence. Lois Nadian Smith, Oklahoma, December 4, 2001. Lois Nadine Smith's crime took place when she was 41 in Oklahoma. According to available details, the incident involved a confrontation that turned deadly. Investigators report that on the day of the crime, Lois was involved in an argument that escalated into a violent struggle. Forensic tests, along with eyewitness accounts, suggested that the killing was not accidental but the result of deliberate actions. During her trial, the prosecution presented strong evidence that showed Lois had taken a life, while the defense argued that her long history of personal and financial hardships might have contributed to her state of mind. Nonetheless, the jury found the evidence sufficient to convict her of first-degree murder. The judge then imposed a death sentence. Lois was executed by lethal injection on December 4, 2001. Her case is often cited when discussing how a single act of violence can close the door on any chance for a changed future. Linda Lionblock, Alabama, May 10, 2002. Linda Lionblock was involved in a violent crime that took place in Alabama when she was 45. The incident, which investigators say was the result of a personal dispute that spiraled out of control. Neighbors reported disturbances on the day of the crime, and police later found physical evidence linking Block to the scene, items that matched her belongings and forensic evidence that could not be ignored. During her trial, prosecutors argued that Linda's actions were deliberate and that she had planned the killing. Eyewitnesses testified about what they saw, and forensic experts confirmed her presence at the scene. Despite efforts by her defense team to argue that personal hardships might have influenced her decisions, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. Alabama's authorities chose electrocution as the method of execution, a detail that shocked many viewers when her sentence was carried out on May 10, 2002. Linda's case raises difficult questions about how a moment of intense conflict can lead to irreversible actions, and how the justice system handles crimes where evidence is both clear and compelling. Aileen Carol Warnos, Florida, October 9, 2002. Aileen Carol Warnos's crimes are among the most infamous in recent American history. Working as a prostitute along Florida's highways, Aileen began a pattern of killing men who picked her up. a practice she later claimed was self-defense against sexual assault. Between 1989 and 1990, she was linked to the murders of 7 men. Police investigations in the early 1990s began to connect a series of similar killings, and Aileen was arrested after being spotted near several crime scenes. Forensic evidence, along with her own later statements, helped build the case against her. At her trial, prosecutors detailed how she had shot her victims, often in isolated areas along highways. Despite arguments from her defense about her rough upbringing and life on the streets, the jury convicted her on multiple counts of murder. She was sentenced to death after the trial and, following years of appeals and national media coverage, was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Warnos's case remains a subject of public debate regarding mental health and the limits of personal responsibility when a life is marked by extreme hardship. Frances Elaine Newton, Texas, September 14, 2005. Frances Elaine Newton's crime took place when she was just 21 in Texas. According to court records, the incident began with a personal dispute that escalated into violence at her home. And when police arrived, they discovered evidence that pointed to Newton's involvement in the death of a man with whom she had a volatile relationship. Investigators collected witness statements and physical evidence that clearly tied her to the scene. During her trial, prosecutors argued that Newton had planned the killing and that her actions were both deliberate and cold-blooded. Her defense pointed to a long history of personal problems and isolation, but the jury remained convinced by the evidence. Newton was convicted of first-degree murder and was handed a death sentence during a sentencing hearing held shortly after her conviction. Despite numerous appeals over the years and debates about whether her troubled past should have altered her sentence, the death sentence was upheld. On September 14, 2005, Texas executed Frances Elaine Newton by lethal injection. Her case is often remembered for the stark contrast between her youth and the finality of her punishment. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis, Virginia, September 23, 2010. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis was involved in a serious crime in Virginia when she was 33. Reports state that during a heated altercation, Teresa became involved in an incident that resulted in the death of a person. Investigators pieced together the events through a combination of eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence found at the scene, which pointed to her direct involvement in the murder. At trial, prosecutors presented a timeline showing that the killing was not accidental, the result of a series of choices made in the heat of a personal conflict. The defense argued that long-standing personal problems and external pressures had contributed to her actions, but the evidence was strong. The jury convicted Teresa of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to death during a hearing that took place within a year of the crime. Despite appeals and public debates over the possibility of rehabilitation, the courts upheld the sentence. Virginia carried out her sentence by lethal injection on September 23, 2010. Teresa's case is often cited as an example of how a single moment of intense conflict can lead to irreversible consequences and how the justice system treats such grave matters. Kimberly LaGale McCarthy, Texas, June 26, 2013. Kimberly LaGale McCarthy was convicted of a murder that took place in Texas when she was 36. According to records, the crime occurred during an argument that escalated beyond control. Investigators report that on the day in question, a dispute led to a fatal shooting. Evidence was gathered from the scene, such as fingerprints and ballistics, that linked Kimberly directly to the incident. Witnesses testified about the heated exchange that preceded the murder, and forensic experts confirmed that her firearm had been used in the crime. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the killing was premeditated, while the defense pointed to a difficult life and personal challenges that might have contributed to her decision-making. However, the jury found the evidence overwhelming. Kimberly was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death in a trial that spanned several months, and despite appeals that highlighted her troubled past, the sentence was upheld. Texas ultimately executed her by lethal injection on June 26, 2013. Her case remains a subject of debate regarding whether personal hardship can ever mitigate the consequences of a deliberate act of taking a life. Suzanne Margaret Basso, Texas, February 5, 2014. Suzanne Margaret Basso's crime occurred in Texas when she was 44. In a case that shocked local communities, Suzanne was accused and later convicted of murdering an individual during a violent confrontation. Reports indicate that the incident began during a personal dispute that turned unexpectedly violent. Investigators pieced together the events through eyewitness accounts and physical evidence, including items left at the scene and forensic tests that confirmed her involvement. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Basso had carefully planned the murder, while the defense maintained that her long-standing personal difficulties and emotional instability had played a role. Despite these arguments, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death during a sentencing phase held shortly after her conviction, and her appeals failed to reverse the decision. Texas carried out her sentence by lethal injection on February 5, 2014. Suzanne's case is often referenced in discussions about whether personal history and hardship should be considered in sentencing, even when the evidence of a planned, violent crime is clear. Lisa Ann Coleman, Texas, September 17, 2014. Lisa Ann Coleman's criminal case in Texas began when she was 28, following an incident that ended in a fatal shooting. Neighbors reported a disturbance on the day of the incident, and police later found physical evidence, including a used firearm and personal belongings that pointed to her involvement in the murder. The investigation revealed that the crime was the result of an argument that escalated into deadly violence. At trial, prosecutors presented eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence. The defense argued that her history of personal and social problems contributed to her poor decision-making, but the evidence led the jury to convict her of a first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death during the trial's sentencing phase, with the decision reflecting the severity of taking a life. Despite appeals from supporters who believed her troubled background might have warranted leniency, the sentence was maintained. On September 17, 2014, Texas executed Lisa Ann Coleman by lethal injection. Her case remains a stark example of how a single moment of violence can lead to a final, irreversible punishment. Kelly Renee Gisson-Danner, Georgia, September 30, 2015. Kelly Renee Gisson-Danner's crime took place in Georgia when she was 28. In a case that drew significant media attention, Kelly was accused of orchestrating the murder of a man during a violent domestic dispute. Investigators say that evidence, including witness accounts and forensic findings, linked her to the crime. Neighbors recalled disturbances on the day of the incident, and items recovered at the scene helped build the case against her. At trial, prosecutors argued that Kelly had not only participated in the murder, but had also played a role in planning it. Despite arguments from her defense that highlighted her difficult personal history and emotional struggles, the jury convicted her of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death after a series of hearings that examined both the facts of the crime and her background. Despite numerous appeals calling for leniency, Georgia's courts upheld the sentence, and on September 30, 2015, Kelly was executed by lethal injection. Her case is often discussed in debates over whether the justice system gives enough weight to a person's personal hardships when a violent, premeditated act has been committed. Lisa Marie Montgomery, Federal, January 13, 2021. Lisa Marie Montgomery's case is one of the most disturbing and widely discussed in recent history. In 1997, she kidnapped and murdered a young child, a crime that shocked the nation. According to reports, Lisa lured the victim away, and once isolated, she committed the murder in a manner that was both brutal and calculated. Investigators pieced together her actions through eyewitness accounts, physical evidence from the crime scene, and her own statements during interrogations. The trial focused on the cruelty of her actions, and prosecutors detailed how the kidnapping and subsequent murder were premeditated. During the trial, her defense argued that her long history of abuse, mental illness, and severe personal trauma might explain her actions, though they did not justify them. and she was sentenced to death by the federal court. Despite years of appeals and public outcry about whether her troubled past should mitigate her punishment, the sentence remained in place. On January 13, 2021, she was executed by lethal injection. Her case forces a difficult look at how the legal system handles crimes that involve extreme abuse and loss of innocent life.